The terrifying story of 1893, the Colorado mountain man who sold furs that weren't from any native animal. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your messages. Now, let's begin. Winter came early to Leadville, Colorado in 1893. By mid-November, snow lay 3 feet deep in the streets, and the mining town huddled beneath a sky the color of old iron. The smell of coal smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of pine and frozen earth. At nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, Leadville was one of the highest towns in America, a place where fortunes were made in silver mines and lost in saloons, where men came to disappear or reinvent themselves. On a particularly bitter afternoon, when the temperature had dropped so low that breath froze in beards and eyelashes, a stranger rode into town on a mule loaded with bundled canvas. He was a tall man, gaunt as a winter tree, with a face carved by wind and sun into deep lines. His beard was long and unkempt, streaked with grey, and his eyes, those eyes were what people noticed first. They were pale, almost colourless, like ice over deep water, and they never seemed to blink. His name, he said, was Ezekiel Thorne. He'd come down from the high peaks to trade. The first person he approached was Marcus Webb, owner of Webb's Trading Post on Harrison Avenue, the main artery running through Leadville's commercial heart. Marcus was a practical man, 50 years old, who'd seen every kind of pelt the Rockies had to offer: beaver, fox, bear, mountain lion, wolf. He prided himself on being able to identify any fur at a glance. The bell above his door chimed as Ezekiel entered, stamping snow from his boots. Without a word, the stranger unwrapped one of his bundles on the counter. Marcus leaned forward, squinting in the lamplight. Then he froze. The fur that lay before him was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was large, easily 6 feet long, with a texture that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light, almost iridescent. The color shifted depending on the angle. Deep silver in shadow, pale gold in direct light, with streaks of something that looked almost blue running through it. The hair itself was impossibly soft, finer than mink, yet thick as bear. Marcus reached out slowly, running his fingers across the surface. It was warm to the touch, warmer than it should be, considering it had just come in from the freezing cold. What animal is this from?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ezekiel's pale eyes fixed on him. "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters," Marcus said, pulling his hand back. "I need to know what I'm buying. I've never seen anything like this." "Then you've never been deep enough into the mountains," Ezekiel replied. His voice was rough, like gravel scraped across stone. "There are things up there most folks don't know about, things that don't come down to where people live." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're telling me this came from some kind of unknown species?" Ezekiel said nothing. He simply stared, waiting. Marcus examined the pelt more closely. The edges were perfectly intact. No bullet holes, no trap marks, no signs of how the animal had been killed. The skin side was oddly thick, almost leathery, with a faint pattern that looked almost like scales rather than typical hide. Against his better judgment, Marcus made an offer. "I'll give you $50. Ezekiel didn't move. 200. 200? That's robbery. "Then don't buy it." Ezekiel began rolling the fur back up. "Wait." Marcus's hand shot out. Despite every instinct telling him something was wrong, he couldn't let this opportunity pass. If he could sell this to the right collector in Denver or San Francisco. 100. Final offer." Ezekiel studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Cash." The transaction was completed in silence. As Ezekiel turned to leave, Marcus called after him. "Will you be bringing more?" The stranger paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Without turning around, he said, "Every full moon. If you're still buying." Then he was gone. disappearing into the swirling snow like a ghost. Word spread quickly through Leadville. By evening, half the town had heard about the strange fur at Webb's trading post. People came to see it, to touch it, to marvel at its impossible beauty. Among the curious was Dr. Adelaide Frost, one of the few women in Leadville with any formal education. She'd come west from Boston 5 years earlier, following her late husband's dreams of frontier medicine. Adelaide was a sharp-eyed woman of 38, with greying auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. Unlike most of the Gawkers, she approached the pelt with scientific interest rather than greed. "May I examine this more closely?" she asked Marcus. He nodded, watching as she produced a small magnifying glass from her medical bag. For several minutes she studied the fur in silence, her brow furrowing deeper with each passing moment. "This is extraordinary," she finally said. "The hair structure is completely unlike any mammal I've studied. See here." She pointed to a strand under magnification. "The cuticle pattern is wrong. It's almost reptilian, but warm-blooded creatures don't have scales like this." "What are you saying, Doctor?" Adelaide straightened, her expression troubled. "I'm saying I have no idea what this came from, and that concerns me greatly." That night, as snow fell thick and silent over Leadville, Adelaide sat in her small office writing letters to colleagues in the East, naturalists, zoologists, anyone who might help identify the mysterious pelt. But even as she wrote, a question gnawed at her mind. If Ezekiel Thorne was hunting something unknown in those mountains, what else might be living up there in the deep winter darkness? 3 weeks passed. The full moon came and went without any sign of Ezekiel Thorne. Marcus Webb began to think he'd imagined the whole encounter, until one morning when he opened his shop and found the stranger standing at his counter, silent as death, with 3 more bundles of fur. This time the pelts were even larger, and they smelled faintly of something Marcus couldn't identify, something sharp and chemical, like copper mixed with pine resin. "Where exactly are you hunting these things?" Marcus asked as he counted out bills. Ezekiel's pale eyes drifted toward the window, toward the white peaks visible in the distance. "Where the mountain breathes," he said quietly, "where the old caves run deep, and the air tastes like iron." "I don't understand." "You're not meant to." Ezekiel pocketed the money. "Just keep buying. That's all you need to do." But Marcus noticed something he hadn't before. Ezekiel's hands. They were covered in scars, deep, jagged marks that looked like burns and cuts layered over years, and his fingernails were split and blackened as though he'd been clawing at stone. As winter deepened and the moon cycled through its phases, Ezekiel Thorne became a fixture in Leadville, arriving always at night, always silent, always carrying those impossible furs that Marcus sold for fortunes to collectors back east. But people began to notice other things too. Ezekiel never stayed in town. He never ate in the restaurants, never drank in the saloons, never slept in the boarding houses. He would complete his transaction and vanish back into the mountains, riding his mule up trails that disappeared into clouds. And there was something else. Something whispered only in private, the smell that clung to him. Not just sweat and smoke, but something deeper, something rotten and sweet at the same time, like meat left too long in a warm cellar. Dr. Adelaide Frost watched him from her window one night as he rode past. The moon was full, casting silver light across the snow, and for just a moment, just one terrible moment, she thought she saw something following him. A shape, tall and hunched, moving through the trees at the edge of town. When she blinked, it was gone. But the feeling remained. They were not alone in these mountains. And whatever Ezekiel Thorne was hunting might also be hunting him. December brought storms that buried Leadville under drifts taller than a man. The mine operations slowed to a crawl, and the town turned inward, huddling around stoves and fireplaces while the wind screamed through the narrow streets like something alive and angry. But Ezekiel Thorne kept coming. Every full moon without fail, he appeared at Marcus Webb's trading post with more furs, each one more extraordinary than the last. By Christmas, Marcus had sold pelts to wealthy collectors in San Francisco, Chicago, and even as far as New York. The money flowed like water, and with it came questions. Letters arrived at Webb's trading post from naturalists and university professors, all demanding to know the source of these remarkable specimens. The Smithsonian Institution itself had written, expressing interest in acquiring one for study, but Marcus had no answers to give them because Ezekiel Thorne refused to explain. Dr. Adelaide Frost had become obsessed with the mystery. She'd examined every pelt that passed through Marcus's shop, taking samples of hair and skin, documenting everything in meticulous detail. Her medical practice suffered as she spent more and more time bent over microscopes and reference books, searching for any animal that matched what she was seeing. Nothing came close. The hair samples showed characteristics of multiple species, the density of bear fur, the fineness of mink, but with a protein structure she'd never encountered. Under high magnification, the individual hairs appeared almost crystalline, with internal striations that caught light like prisms. Even stranger were the skin samples. The hide was extraordinarily thick, nearly half an inch in places, and showed a cellular structure that seemed to fall somewhere between mammalian and reptilian. When she'd tried to section a small piece for mounting, her scalpel had dulled immediately, as though she'd been trying to cut leather that had been stone-hardened. One evening in early January, as another blizzard raged outside, Adelaide sat in Marcus's back office, warming her hands around a cup of coffee. Between them on the desk lay the latest pelt Ezekiel had brought. This one nearly 8 feet long, with fur that shifted from white to pale green in the lamplight. "This is madness," Adelaide said quietly. "These can't be natural animals. The biology doesn't make sense." Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhausted. "Then what are they?" "I don't know, but I intend to find out." She looked up at him, her expression grave. "I want to follow him. Next time he comes to town, I want to see where he goes." "That's dangerous, Adelaide. Those mountains in winter." "I know the risks. But Marcus, don't you understand? If there's an undiscovered species living in the Rockies, something this large, this unusual, it could change everything we know about North American fauna. This could be the discovery of the century." Marcus studied her face and saw the fervor there, the same obsessive gleam he'd seen in the eyes of miners who'd struck a promising vein and couldn't stop digging, even when the tunnel walls began to creak. "I'll go with you," he said finally, "but we do this carefully. We don't approach him directly, we just observe." Adelaide nodded, but both of them knew they were lying to themselves. Curiosity had taken root, and like a poison, it would drive them forward, regardless of the cost. The next full moon rose on January 15th. Marcus and Adelaide waited in the shadows across from the trading post, dressed in heavy furs and armed with lanterns and rifles. They'd hired 2 pack horses and convinced themselves they were prepared for whatever they might find. Ezekiel arrived just after midnight, as silent as ever. He conducted his business quickly. 3 more pelts, each one larger than the last. Marcus noticed that the mountain man's appearance had deteriorated since his last visit. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his hands trembled slightly as he counted the money. There was a wildness in his pale eyes that hadn't been there before. When Ezekiel left, Marcus and Adelaide followed at a careful distance. The trail led north out of town, climbing steeply into the high country. The moon was brilliant that night, turning the snow-covered landscape into a world of silver and shadow. They followed Ezekiel's tracks for hours, their horses struggling through drifts, their breath freezing in clouds. Around 3 in the morning, they reached a plateau where the trees thinned out and bare rock emerged from the snow. Ezekiel had stopped here, and they watched from cover as he dismounted and stood staring up at the mountain face above. He was singing, or chanting rather, a low rhythmic sound in a language neither Marcus nor Adelaide recognized. The words seemed to echo strangely off the rocks, reverberating longer than they should. Then Ezekiel pulled something from his saddlebag, a bundle of what looked like dried meat. He placed it carefully on a flat rock, arranged it in a pattern, then stepped back. "What in God's name is he doing?" Marcus whispered. Adelaide didn't answer. She was watching the mountain face above, where something had caught her attention. In the shadows of an overhanging cliff, there was movement. At first, she thought it might be an optical illusion, the way moonlight and shadow can play tricks on tired eyes. But then she saw it again, a shifting of darkness, a subtle change in the texture of the rock face. Something was there, watching. Ezekiel finished his chant and remounted his mule, but instead of continuing up the trail, he turned and looked directly at where Marcus and Adelaide were hiding. For a long, terrible moment, his pale eyes locked onto Adelaide's through the darkness. Then he smiled, a thin, joyless expression. "You shouldn't have followed me," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen air. "Now they know you're here." Before either of them could respond, Ezekiel rode off into the night, disappearing around a bend in the trail. "We should go back," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. But Adelaide was still staring at the cliff face, where the shadows continued to move. "Look," she breathed. "Marcus, look." Something emerged from the overhang. It moved slowly, deliberately, climbing down the rock face with an impossible grace. In the moonlight, they caught glimpses, a long, serpentine body covered in fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, limbs that bent at wrong angles, a head that was neither wolf nor bear, but something in between, with eyes that glowed faintly yellow. It was enormous, at least 12 feet from nose to tail, and moved with a fluid, predatory elegance that made Adelaide's blood run cold. The creature reached the flat rock where Ezekiel had left his offering. It sniffed once, then consumed the meat in a single gulp. Then its head swiveled toward where they hid. "Don't move," Adelaide whispered, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "Don't even breathe." The creature stared at them for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, it opened its mouth and made a sound, a low, resonating call that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the mountain. The sound was answered from somewhere above. First one voice, then another, then a dozen more, until the entire mountainside seemed to be singing. Marcus grabbed Adelaide's arm. "We're leaving, now!" They ran. The horses, panicked by the sounds, needed no encouragement. They plunged back down the trail, slipping and sliding through the snow, while behind them those terrible calls continued to echo through the night. Adelaide glanced back once and saw them, dozens of shapes moving through the trees, following at a distance, their yellow eyes glowing like lanterns in the darkness. They didn't stop until they reached the outskirts of Leadville. Just as dawn was breaking, both of them were shaking, frost-bitten, and traumatized by what they'd witnessed. "What were those things?" Marcus gasped, his face pale. Adelaide shook her head, unable to speak. Her scientific mind was reeling, trying to categorize what she'd seen and failing completely. Those creatures defied every law of nature she knew. As the sun rose over Leadville, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink, Adelaide made a decision. She had to know more. She had to understand what those creatures were, where they came from, and why Ezekiel Thorne was hunting them, even if it killed her. Over the following weeks, Adelaide began her own investigation. She interviewed old-timers who'd been in the mountains for decades, searching for any legends or stories about unusual creatures in the high country. What she found was disturbing. The Ute Indians, who'd lived in these mountains for centuries before being driven out, had stories of the skinwalkers of the high peaks, beings that were neither animal nor spirit, but something in between. They lived in the deepest caves, emerging only during full moons to hunt. The Utes had considered the entire northern range sacred and forbidden. Early trappers from the 1850s had occasionally reported seeing wolves that walked like men, or bears with too many legs. Most of these reports had been dismissed as tall tales or the hallucinations of men who'd spent too long alone in the wilderness. But now, Adelaide wondered, what if they'd all been true? She also discovered something else. Ezekiel Thorne wasn't the first person to try hunting these creatures. 20 years earlier, a group of trappers had ventured into the same region, seeking what they called the Silver Wolves. Only one had returned, driven mad and unable to speak coherently. He died in an asylum in Denver, but not before drawing hundreds of sketches, images of creatures with too many limbs, too many teeth, bodies that seemed to shift and change shape. The drawings looked exactly like what Adelaide had seen on the mountain. One night, unable to sleep, Adelaide sat at her desk and wrote everything down, detailed descriptions of the creatures, diagrams of their anatomy based on the pelts, theories about their biology. She sealed these documents in an envelope addressed to the Smithsonian Institution, with instructions to open it only if something happened to her. Then she waited for the next full moon. When Ezekiel Thorne came to town again, Adelaide was ready. But this time, she didn't follow him. Instead, she confronted him directly, stepping out of the shadows as he left Marcus's shop. "I know what you're hunting," she said. Ezekiel's pale eyes fixed on her. "Then you're a fool. Tell me about them. Please. I need to understand." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, surprisingly, he gestured toward a nearby alley. "You have 5 minutes." In the shelter of the alley, out of the wind, Ezekiel spoke in a low, rapid voice. "They're old. Older than humans, older than the Utes, older than anything. They've been in these mountains since before the ice came. They sleep deep in the caves during most of the year, but when winter comes and the moon is full, they wake. They hunt." "What do they hunt?" "Anything warm, deer, elk, bear, and if you're foolish enough to be out there alone..." He let the sentence hang. "Why do you hunt them?" Ezekiel's expression darkened. "Because they killed my family 5 years ago. My wife, my 2 daughters, we were trapping up near the headwaters. I'd gone to check the lines when I came back." His voice cracked. There was nothing left but blood in the snow. Adelaide felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just stay away from the mountains. Those pelts I bring down, each one takes months to hunt. I know their territory, their patterns, their weaknesses. But even I..." He held up his scarred hands. "Even I barely survive each time. What are their weaknesses?" Ezekiel shook his head. "That's not information I'm giving away. You want to study them? Write your papers? That's not going to happen. These things need to stay hidden, stay feared, stay in the deep places where people don't go. But science, he spat the word like a curse, will get people killed. Men will come with guns and ambition, thinking they can capture one, put it in a cage, study it, and they'll die screaming." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Doctor. They know about you now. You followed me. They saw you. They remember scents, faces. You're marked." Before Adelaide could respond, he was gone, swallowed by the winter night. She stood alone in the alley, watching snow begin to fall again, and for the first time since arriving in Colorado, Adelaide Frost felt true fear. Somewhere high in those mountains, things with yellow eyes were remembering her scent. And winter was far from over. February came to Leadville like a slow curse. The temperatures dropped so low that whiskey froze in bottles, and the wind carried a sound that seemed almost like voices, distant, plaintive, calling from the peaks. Adelaide Frost stopped sleeping well. Every night she woke to the same sensation, the feeling of being watched. She would sit up in her narrow bed, heart pounding, and scan the darkness of her small cabin. Nothing was ever there. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing night. She'd also begun noticing things around town. Small things at first. Tracks in the snow outside her window that were too large to be dog prints, too deliberate to be random. Scratch marks on her doorframe, deep grooves in the wood that appeared overnight, and once, Just once, she woke to find a single tuft of fur on her windowsill, silver white, iridescent, identical to the pelts Ezekiel brought down from the mountains. The message was clear. They knew where she lived. Marcus Webb noticed the change in her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled when she examined the new pelts Ezekiel continued to bring. He pulled her aside one afternoon, concern etched in his weathered face. "Adelaide, you need to leave Leadville, go back east. Whatever's happening, it's not worth your life." She shook her head stubbornly. "I can't leave. Not now. I'm so close to understanding." "Understanding what? That there are monsters in these mountains? We already know that." "Not monsters," she insisted. "A species. Something that's survived here, hidden, for thousands of years. Marcus, do you realize what this means? The evolutionary implications alone." "I don't care about evolution." Marcus grabbed her shoulders. "Listen to me. Ezekiel told you they've marked you. That means they're hunting you." Adelaide pulled away. "Then I'll be careful." But being careful wasn't enough. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, a miner named Jacob Riley disappeared. He'd been working a claim in the foothills, about 5 miles north of town. When he didn't return for dinner, his wife raised the alarm. A search party went out at first light. They found his camp torn apart. The tent was shredded, supplies scattered across the snow. Blood painted the white ground in wide arcs. Too much blood for anyone to have survived. But there was no body. What they did find were tracks. Dozens of them, pressed deep into the frozen earth, large clawed prints that looked like a cross between bear and wolf, but with an extra digit on each paw. The tracks circled the camp multiple times before heading back up into the high country. Adelaide was called to examine the scene. She brought her medical bag and her notebook, documenting everything with the detached precision of a scientist. But inside, her mind was racing. The attack pattern was deliberate, methodical. These creatures weren't mindless beasts. They were intelligent predators, and they'd come dangerously close to town. As she knelt in the blood-stained snow, measuring paw prints, she heard something that made her blood freeze. A low, resonating call from somewhere up the mountain. The same sound she'd heard that night when she'd followed Ezekiel. The other men in the search party heard it too. They exchanged nervous glances, gripping their rifles tighter. "We should head back," one of them said, his voice tight. "Sun's going down." Adelaide looked up at the peaks, where shadows were already lengthening. She thought of Jacob Riley, torn apart in the darkness. She thought of Ezekiel Thorne's scarred hands and haunted eyes, and she thought of the yellow eyes watching her from the trees. "Yes," she said quietly. "We should go." They made it back to Leadville, just as the last light faded from the sky. That night, the entire town locked their doors and loaded their guns. No one spoke of what they feared, but everyone knew. The creatures were coming down from the high country. 3 days later, Ezekiel Thorne rode into Leadville in broad daylight. Something he'd never done before. His mule was exhausted, its flanks heaving, and Ezekiel himself looked half dead. Blood stained his coat, and his face was grey with pain and exhaustion. He nearly fell from the saddle outside Webb's trading post. Adelaide, who happened to be there, rushed to help him. Marcus appeared from inside, and together they carried the mountain man into the back room. "What happened?" Adelaide demanded, cutting away his coat to reveal deep gashes across his chest and shoulder. The wounds were savage, clearly made by claws. Ezekiel's pale eyes found hers. "They're moving," he gasped. "Coming lower. Something's wrong. They've never hunted this close to settlements before." "Why? What's changed?" He grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "You. They want you. I don't know why, but ever since you followed me, they've been different, agitated. It's like they see you as a threat." Adelaide felt ice settle in her stomach. "That's impossible. I'm just one person." "You studied them, took samples, wrote about them." Ezekiel coughed, and blood flecked his lips. "They're smart, Doctor. Smarter than you think. They understand what it means when humans start documenting things. They know what comes next. More humans, more guns, more danger. As Adelaide stitched his wounds, Ezekiel told them what had happened. He'd been checking his trap lines in the high country when a pack of the creatures had ambushed him. Not the usual 1 or 2 he encountered, but 7 of them, working in coordinated attack patterns. He'd barely escaped with his life, killing 1 and wounding 2 others. But the rest had followed him for miles, only breaking off when he got close to Leadville's outskirts. "They've never been this aggressive," he said. "Never hunted in packs this large. Something's changed their behavior." Marcus paced the small room, running his hands through his hair. "So what do? We can't fight them. You said yourself they're nearly impossible to kill." "We need to leave," Ezekiel said flatly. "Everyone. Evacuate Leadville until spring, when they go back into hibernation." "That's insane," Marcus protested. "This town has 10,000 people. Where would they go? And in the middle of winter? Then a lot of people are going to die." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Adelaide finished bandaging Ezekiel's wounds and sat back, her mind working through possibilities. "What if we could communicate with them? Find some way to show we're not a threat?" Both men stared at her, as if she'd lost her mind. "Communicate?" Ezekiel's laugh was bitter. "Doctor, these things don't negotiate. They don't compromise. They're apex predators that have ruled these mountains for millennia. We're just meat to them." "But you said they're intelligent." "Intelligent doesn't mean reasonable. A wolf is intelligent too, but you can't negotiate with it when it's hungry." Adelaide refused to give up. There has to be a way, some pattern to their behavior, some... She was interrupted by shouting from outside. The 3 of them rushed to the window and looked out onto Harrison Avenue. People were pointing at the mountains, their faces pale with fear. Adelaide felt her breath catch. All along the ridgeline, clearly visible even in the fading afternoon light, were shapes. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, sitting motionless in the snow, watching the town below. The creatures had come. That night, Leadville prepared for war. Every able-bodied man armed himself. Barricades were built at the northern edge of town. Fires were lit in a perimeter, creating a ring of light that might keep the creatures at bay. Adelaide stood watch with Marcus and a group of miners, her rifle clutched in numb hands. She'd never fired a gun at a living thing before, and prayed she wouldn't have to start now. Ezekiel was there too, despite his injuries. He moved through the defenses, giving advice on how to fight the creatures if they attacked. "Go for the eyes first," he told the men. "They're vulnerable there, and if you hit one, don't assume it's dead. They can take multiple bullets and keep coming." "How do you kill them?" someone asked. Ezekiel's expression was grim. "Fire. Burn the bodies completely. Otherwise, they heal. I've seen one recover from wounds that would kill a grizzly." As midnight approached, the temperature dropped further. The fires crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows across the snow. And all along the ridge, those shapes remained, waiting, watching. Adelaide found herself standing next to Ezekiel. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why are they doing this?" He was silent for a long time. Then, "I think they know their time is ending. Humans keep pushing deeper into the mountains. Mines, railroads, settlements. For thousands of years, they had the high country to themselves. But that's changing, and they know it. So this is, what, a last stand? Maybe. Or maybe they're just hungry." He glanced at her. "You really think you can understand them? Find some scientific explanation that makes sense of all this?" "I have to try." "Why?" It was a simple question, but Adelaide found she didn't have a simple answer. Why was she risking everything for creatures that wanted to kill her? Why couldn't she just leave, go back to Boston, forget she'd ever seen those yellow eyes in the darkness? "Because they're beautiful," she said finally. "Terrible and beautiful. And if we don't try to understand them, we'll just destroy them. And something that survived for thousands of years, doesn't that deserve a chance?" Ezekiel studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most foolish. "I haven't decided which." Before Adelaide could respond, one of the watchers shouted, "They're moving!" All along the ridgeline, the shapes rose, and then, as if responding to some unheard signal, they began descending toward the town. The attack had begun. What happened next would be remembered in Leadville's history as the Night of the Silver Wolves, though those who survived would never agree on exactly what they'd seen in the chaos of firelight and shadow. The creatures came in waves, testing the defenses, probing for weaknesses. They moved with terrifying speed, their bodies flowing through the snow like liquid darkness. Rifle fire cracked across the night, and some of the creatures fell, but others kept coming. Adelaide fired until her rifle was empty, then reloaded with shaking hands. She saw one of the creatures up close, its yellow eyes fixed on her with unmistakable intelligence. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Ezekiel stepped between them and fired point-blank into the creature's face. It screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and retreated into the darkness. "Stay close to me," Ezekiel commanded. The battle raged for hours. By the time dawn finally broke, painting the snow pink and gold, the creatures had withdrawn back to the high country. They left behind 3 dead, their bodies already being gathered for burning, per Ezekiel's instructions. But the town had paid a price too. 5 people dead, a dozen wounded, and a collective trauma that would never fully heal. As Adelaide helped tend the wounded, she kept thinking about that moment when she'd locked eyes with one of the creatures. There had been something there, some spark of recognition, of understanding. These weren't just animals, they were something more, something ancient and unknowable. And deep in her scientific soul, Adelaide Frost knew she had to learn their secrets, no matter the cost. In the aftermath of the attack, Leadville became a town divided. Half the population wanted to flee south to Denver or Colorado Springs, convinced that staying meant certain death. The other half, stubborn miners and merchants who'd invested everything in this high-altitude town, insisted on fortifying their defenses and waiting out the winter. Adelaide Frost found herself caught between science and survival. The 3 creature corpses that had been recovered offered an unprecedented opportunity for study, but the town council had ordered them burned immediately. She'd managed to salvage only small samples: tissue, bone fragments, teeth. Enough to confirm what she'd suspected, but not enough to satisfy her burning curiosity. The tissue samples were extraordinary. Under her microscope, the cellular structure appeared almost crystalline, with a protein composition unlike anything in the known animal kingdom. The bones were incredibly dense, nearly twice as heavy as mammalian bone of comparable size. And the teeth, curved, serrated, designed for tearing, showed wear patterns suggesting an omnivorous diet. But the most disturbing discovery came from the stomach contents of one specimen. Among the partially digested matter, Adelaide found fabric, metal buttons, and fragments of human bone. They didn't just kill humans, they consumed them. Ezekiel Thorne recovered slowly from his wounds. He'd taken over a room in the back of Marcus Webb's shop, refusing to leave town despite the danger. Adelaide visited him daily to change his bandages and found him increasingly troubled. "Something's wrong," he told her one afternoon, staring at the ceiling. "They shouldn't have attacked the town. It breaks their pattern. For 5 years I've hunted them, and they've never once come this close to civilization." "Maybe they're adapting," Adelaide suggested, "changing their behavior in response to the threat you represent." "No." Ezekiel sat up, wincing at the pain. "It's more than that. The attack was coordinated, deliberate. They were testing us, learning our defenses. That's not animal behavior, that's strategic thinking." "What are you saying?" His pale eyes met hers. "I'm saying these creatures might be more intelligent than we are." The thought sent chills down Adelaide's spine. An intelligent species, unknown to science, living in the highest peaks of the Rockies. If Ezekiel was right, this changed everything. I need to see where they live, she said suddenly. Their dens, their territory. If we can understand their social structure, their breeding patterns, you want to go to the caves. It wasn't a question. Yes. Ezekiel laughed, a harsh sound. Then you want to die. Those caves run for miles through the mountain. It's their domain, their fortress. I've only been inside once and I barely escaped. But you survived. You know the way. Dr. Frost. He gripped her wrist. You're asking me to lead you into hell itself. Do you understand that? Adelaide held his gaze. I understand, but if we don't learn about them, really learn, not just kill them, then this conflict will never end. More towns will be attacked. More people will die. We need knowledge, Ezekiel. It's our only weapon. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. You're right, God help us both, but you're right. When do we leave? Tomorrow night, during the new moon, when they're less active. He released her wrist. But doctor, if we do this, there's a good chance neither of us comes back. I know. They departed Lidville on February 22nd, just after sunset. Marcus Webb had tried to stop them, calling it suicide. But Adelaide was resolute. She carried her medical bag, notebooks, and a small camera, one of the new Kodak models that used dry plates. If she was going to die in those mountains, she intended to leave behind proof of what she'd discovered. Ezekiel led the way on his mule, with Adelaide following on a sturdy mountain horse. They traveled light, carrying only essential supplies, rope, lanterns, weapons, and dried food. The night was bitter cold, with stars so bright they cast shadows on the snow. They climbed for hours, following trails only Ezekiel could see. As they ascended, Adelaide noticed changes in the landscape. The trees became stunted and twisted, their branches gnarled into shapes that looked almost deliberate, like wooden sentinels marking forbidden territory. Around midnight, they reached a plateau where massive boulders jutted from the snow like broken teeth. Ezekiel dismounted and began examining the ground. This is the boundary, he said quietly. Past this point, we're in their hunting grounds. Adelaide's heart hammered as she looked around. In the starlight, she could see tracks everywhere, dozens of them, crisscrossing the snow in complex patterns. Some were fresh, made within the last few hours. We leave the horses here, Ezekiel continued. From now on, we go on foot. Stay close, stay quiet, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Adelaide nodded, not trusting her voice. They proceeded deeper into the high country, moving between massive rock formations that seemed to absorb sound. Adelaide had never experienced such complete silence. No wind, no animal calls, nothing but the crunch of their boots in the snow. After an hour of careful hiking, Ezekiel stopped and pointed upward. Adelaide followed his gesture and gasped. The mountain face before them was riddled with openings, dozens of caves, like dark eyes staring down from the rock. Some were small, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Others were massive, gaping maws that could swallow a wagon whole. This is it, Ezekiel whispered. The colony. How many live here? I don't know. Hundreds, maybe thousands. They go deep, Doctor, miles into the mountain. As they watched, something moved at one of the cave mouths. A shape emerged, silhouetted against the slightly lighter darkness. One of the creatures, its yellow eyes gleaming as it surveyed its territory. After a moment, it retreated back inside. We're going in there. Adelaide's voice was barely audible. The smallest cave on the eastern side. It's a side tunnel that connects to the main system. If we're lucky, it'll be unguarded. He looked at her. Last chance to turn back. Adelaide thought of Boston, of warm libraries and civilized society, of a life where the worst danger was a carriage accident or bad oysters. Then she thought of those yellow eyes and the mystery they represented. I didn't come this far to turn back now. Ezekiel almost smiled. You know, Doctor, under different circumstances, I think my wife would have liked you. She had that same stubborn streak. They approached the eastern cave entrance with agonizing slowness, every sense alert for danger. The opening was about 6 feet high, barely large enough to walk through upright. Adelaide lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low, and followed Ezekiel inside. The passage was narrow and winding, the walls rough stone that seemed to absorb their lantern light. The air smelled strange, not quite animal, not quite mineral, but something in between, sweet and musty and faintly metallic. They descended steadily, the tunnel growing wider as they penetrated deeper into the mountain. Adelaide ran her hand along the wall and felt something that made her stop, grooves in the stone, deliberate and repeating. She held up her lantern. The walls were covered in markings, spiral patterns, geometric shapes, symbols that looked almost like primitive writing. They'd been carved into the stone with incredible precision. "Ezekiel," she whispered, "look at this." He examined the carvings, his expression troubled. "I've seen these before, deeper in the caves. I thought they were just natural formations, but these are deliberate, intentional. This is art, Ezekiel, or language, or both." The implications were staggering. These creatures didn't just hunt and kill. They created, they communicated, they had culture. They continued deeper, the tunnel opening into a larger chamber. Adelaide raised her lantern higher and immediately wished she hadn't. The chamber was full of bones, human bones, arranged in careful patterns on the floor and stacked against the walls. Skulls were placed in alcoves, femurs arranged in parallel lines, ribs formed into spiraling designs. It wasn't random. It was organized, deliberate, a gallery of the dead. "Dear God," Adelaide breathed. Ezekiel's hand went to his rifle. "We need to leave, now." But Adelaide was already moving forward, her scientific mind overriding her fear. She knelt beside one of the bone arrangements and pulled out her camera. The flash powder ignited with a soft pop, momentarily illuminating the entire chamber in harsh white light. In that instant, Adelaide saw something that made her blood freeze. Dozens of alcoves carved into the walls, and in each one, a creature lay sleeping. They were curled into fetal positions, their bodies rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. They were surrounded. The flash had woken them. Yellow eyes began opening all around the chamber, dozens of pairs, all focusing on the two intruders. "Run," Ezekiel said quietly. They ran. Behind them, the chamber erupted with sound, howls and screams that echoed through the stone corridors. Adelaide's lantern swung wildly as she sprinted through the darkness, following Ezekiel's back, her camera banging against her side. The creatures pursued, their claws scraping on stone, their breathing harsh and eager. Adelaide could feel them behind her, could smell their strange, musky odor, could hear them getting closer with every second. The tunnel forked. Ezekiel went left, and Adelaide followed. But her foot caught on a rock and she fell hard, her lantern flying from her hand and shattering against the wall. Darkness, complete, absolute darkness. She heard Ezekiel shouting her name from somewhere ahead, but she couldn't see anything. She scrambled to her feet, hands outstretched, and ran blindly forward. Something grabbed her ankle. Adelaide screamed as she was pulled backward. Claws tore through her pants leg, into her flesh. She kicked desperately, felt her boot connect with something solid, and suddenly she was free. Light bloomed ahead. Ezekiel had lit a torch. "Here! This way!" Adelaide ran toward the light, her injured legs screaming with every step. Behind her, the creatures howled in fury. She could feel hot breath on her neck, could hear their claws mere inches away. Ezekiel grabbed her arm and pulled her into a narrow crevice. They pressed themselves into the gap as the creatures surged past, unable to fit into the tight space. Yellow eyes glared at them from inches away, and long-clawed arms reached in, swiping blindly. They were trapped. Ezekiel raised his rifle and fired into the mass of bodies. The sound was deafening in the confined space. One creature fell, then another, but more kept coming, piling on top of each other, trying to reach the humans hiding in the rock. "We can't stay here," Adelaide gasped, pressing herself against the stone. "There's a deeper passage," Ezekiel said, pointing downward, "but I don't know where it leads." "Anywhere is better than here." They squeezed through the crevice, descending into darkness, the sounds of pursuit echoing from above. The passage grew tighter, forcing them to crawl on their bellies, dragging their supplies behind them. Adelaide's injured leg left a trail of blood on the stone. She knew the creatures would follow that scent, but there was nothing she could do about it. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the passage opened into another chamber. This one was smaller and empty of bones, but the walls were covered in more carvings, more elaborate than before. And in the center of the room stood something that made Adelaide forget her pain, her fear, everything, a statue. Carved from a single piece of stone, it depicted one of the creatures in perfect detail, but standing upright on two legs, arms raised toward the ceiling in what might have been worship or celebration. Around it, smaller carvings showed creatures hunting, creatures caring for young, creatures living in complex social structures. "They're not animals," Adelaide whispered, pulling out her notebook with shaking hands. "They're a civilization." Ezekiel was examining the other exit from the chamber. Another tunnel, this one sloping upward. "I think this leads back to the surface. But, Doctor, we need to move. They're still coming." Adelaide took one last photograph, the flash briefly illuminating the statue and its surrounding carvings. Then she followed Ezekiel up the ascending tunnel, her mind reeling with implications. They emerged an hour before dawn on the far side of the mountain, exhausted and bleeding but alive. Behind them, howls echoed from the cave mouth, but the creatures didn't emerge into the approaching daylight. As they descended toward Leadville, Adelaide kept looking back at the mountain, thinking about what they'd discovered. These weren't monsters. They were people, different people, strange people, terrible people, but people nonetheless. And she had just invaded their home, stolen their secrets, and killed their kin. The guilt hit her like a physical blow. "Ezekiel," she said quietly, "what have we done?" He didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "What humans always do, Doctor. We've started a war we don't know how to end." Adelaide Frost and Ezekiel Thorne reached Leadville just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the snow-covered town in shades of gold and rose. They were battered, bleeding, and forever changed by what they'd witnessed in the mountain's heart. Adelaide's leg wound required 20 stitches. As Marcus Webb worked on her in his back room, she told him everything: the bone gallery, the carvings, the statue, the undeniable evidence that the creatures were far more than animals. "They have art," she said, her voice distant with shock. "They have religion or something like it. They bury their dead in patterns. They're people, Marcus. Strange, terrible people, but people." Marcus tied off the last stitch and sat back. "Does it matter? They're still killing us." "But don't you see? If they're intelligent, truly intelligent, then maybe we can negotiate?" Marcus shook his head. "Adelaide, you barely escaped with your life. How do you negotiate with something that sees you as food?" She had no answer. Over the next week, Adelaide developed the photographs she'd taken in the caves. The images were grainy and dark, but clear enough to show the bone arrangements, the wall carvings, and most remarkably, the statue. She wrote a detailed report documenting everything, preparing to send it to the Smithsonian Institution, but Ezekiel stopped her. "You can't share this," he said, standing in her cabin doorway. His wounds had healed, but he looked older somehow, more haggard. "If the world knows what's up there, what do you think happens next? Scientific study, proper documentation, perhaps even protection, extermination." Ezekiel's voice was flat. "The government will send the army. They'll dynamite the caves, shoot anything that moves, take specimens for museums. Is that what you want?" Adelaide looked at her photographs, at the evidence of an unknown civilization living in America's highest peaks. "No," she admitted, "but we can't just pretend they don't exist. Why not? The Utes did for centuries. They left the high peaks alone, treated them as sacred. Maybe they had the right idea. And what about the attacks? What about the people who've died? Ezekiel was silent for a long moment. I have an idea, but you won't like it. His plan was simple and terrible. One final hunt. Ezekiel would track down the alpha male, the largest and most dominant of the creatures, and kill it. In the power vacuum that followed, the colony would turn inward, fighting among themselves for dominance. That internal conflict would keep them occupied and away from human settlements, at least for a time. How do you know it will work? Adelaide asked. I don't, but I've watched them long enough to see their social structure. They follow the strongest. Remove that leader and chaos follows. It's murder. It's war. And in war, you target the generals. Adelaide wanted to argue, to find another way, but deep down she knew he was right. The creatures would never stop hunting near Leadville, not unless something changed their behavior dramatically. I'm coming with you, she said. No. You need someone to document what happens, and you'll need medical help if you're injured. You barely survived last time. Ezekiel studied her face, then sighed. You really are the most stubborn woman I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment. They departed Leadville on March 1st, carrying weapons, medical supplies, and Adelaide's camera. Marcus Webb watched them go with the expression of a man attending a funeral. The hunt took 3 days. Ezekiel led them to the highest peaks above the tree line, where the air was so thin that every breath burned. They tracked the alpha through snowfields and across glacier ice, following signs only Ezekiel could read. Claw marks on stone, patches of fur caught on rocks, the faint musky scent that hung in the air. On the 3rd day, they found it. The creature was massive, nearly 15 feet long from nose to tail, with shoulders broader than a grizzly bear. Its fur was pure silver white, catching the sunlight like metal. It stood on a rocky outcrop, surveying its domain, completely unaware of the humans approaching from downwind. Adelaide raised her camera and photographed it in full daylight. The image would be the only clear picture ever taken of one of these creatures in life. Ezekiel raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. His hands were steady, his breathing calm. He'd been preparing for this moment for 5 years, ever since these creatures had taken everything he loved. Ezekiel, Adelaide whispered. Wait. He paused, finger on the trigger. Look at it, really look, it's beautiful. And it was. Despite everything, the attacks, the deaths, the terror, the creature was magnificent. A perfect predator, evolved over millennia to survive in the harshest environment on Earth. In that moment, Adelaide understood what she was witnessing, the end of an era. Once Ezekiel pulled that trigger, the world would be diminished. I know, Ezekiel said softly, but it killed my family, and it will kill again. He fired. The shot echoed across the peaks like thunder. The creature roared, a sound of pain and fury that seemed to shake the very mountains, and charged. What followed was chaos. Ezekiel fired again and again as the wounded alpha bore down on them. Adelaide grabbed her own rifle and added her shots to his. The creature took 6 bullets before it finally fell, sliding across the ice to stop just feet from where they stood. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Adelaide approached slowly, kneeling beside the dying creature. Its yellow eyes found hers, and in them she saw something. Pain, certainly. Rage, but also understanding. Intelligence. The creature's mouth moved and a sound emerged, not a roar or a howl, but something almost like speech, syllables in a language no human had ever learned. Then its eyes dimmed, and it was gone. Ezekiel sat down heavily in the snow, his rifle across his knees. It's done, he said, but there was no triumph in his voice, only emptiness. They stayed there as the sun descended, watching as dozens of other creatures emerged from caves below and approached the body. The creatures circled their fallen leader, making sounds Adelaide had never heard before, keening, mournful sounds that might have been grief. They're mourning, she whispered. Ezekiel said nothing. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, they retreated down the mountain. Behind them, the creature's cries echoed through the peaks, and Adelaide knew she would hear those sounds in her dreams for the rest of her life. They returned to Leadville on March 4th. Word of the Alpha's death spread quickly through the creature colony, and just as Ezekiel had predicted, the attacks on human settlements stopped. The creatures turned inward, fighting among themselves, and gradually retreated deeper into the unexplored peaks. Adelaide spent weeks writing her final report, but in the end, she never sent it. Instead, she sealed all her photographs, tissue samples, and notes in a metal box and buried it beneath the floorboards of her cabin. "Some knowledge," she told Marcus, "isn't meant to be shared." Ezekiel Thorne left Leadville in late March as the first signs of spring appeared. He gave no explanation, simply packed his mule and rode north into the mountains one final time. Adelaide watched him go, understanding what he couldn't say. He was going back to the caves, not to hunt, but to die in the place where his family had been taken. He was never seen again. Epilogue. Dr. Adelaide Frost lived another 40 years, eventually leaving Colorado and returning to Boston. She never married, never spoke publicly about her time in Leadville, and destroyed most of her records before her death in 1933. But she kept one photograph, hidden in a locket she wore until the end, the image of the alpha creature standing on that rocky outcrop, magnificent and terrible, in the mountain sunlight. In her final days, delirious with fever, she was heard speaking in a strange language, harsh syllables